Hey, what's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Bad Eye Podcast. We are back this week and coming at you jet lagged as fuck after circumnavigating the globe. That's right, we are back from our travel break and excited to bring you our takes on things that we care about on a semi regular basis again. I'm your host, Andrew, the Magellan of medium controversial Star Trek takes and apparently fully criminal political opinions, so that's cool. Before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. To our Muslim brothers and sisters, a belated Eid Mubarak. I hope you had a wonderful day and ate some delicious food. For all our listeners, I want to say a big thank you to everyone here who has stuck with us while we were off. I appreciate you bearing with us with the inconsistent release schedule, including this episode, which will be dropping late. Truth be told, I've been struggling a little bit with how I wanted to approach this return episode because so much happened while I was gone. But we also have some pretty cool pre recorded stuff still in the can that I'd hate to just throw away. So this week we're going to be splitting the difference a little bit. I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that happened in the world while we were on break that kind of all deserve their own episodes as kind of a preview of what's to come. And then we're going to get some more of our interview with our guest from the last episode, Abdullah, about his work on harm reduction and the ongoing opioid crisis. Both because he was generous enough to sit down with us and talk about his work, and we here at the Bad Eye Podcast value the time of all of our guests, and because I think his work is important, particularly in the context of our upcoming Canadian federal election, where drug policy might be a bit of a back burner issue this election, given the magnitude of the other issues that are up for discussion. But I think his perspective is an important one to keep in mind all the same if you are Canadian and this is an issue you care about. And it should be. People are literally dying. And you're considering where to put your vote. But before we hear from Abdullah, to the shock of hopefully no one and the chagrin of ideally everyone, Israel has violated the ceasefire agreement it signed with Hamas back in January with a series of surprise airstrikes and a ground invasion in Gaza that has killed more than 1,000 people since March 18th, when the ceasefire was first broken. The Israeli government's official position is that Hamas violated the ceasefire deal by refusing to unilaterally release all the remaining Israeli hostages, a provision that, incidentally, was not in the original ceasefire deal. The second phase of the original deal did include the release of all living Israeli hostages, but only in exchange for more Palestinian prisoners, a term I personally object to because the distinction between a prisoner and a hostage in the context of the Israeli military justice system is blurry at best, but that's neither here nor there, as well as the full Israeli military withdrawal from Gaza and a lasting ceasefire. Obviously, none of those things have happened. Israel refused to release any Palestinian prisoners and appears to be doing their best to ensure that none of the Israeli hostages are returned alive either. Because if that is their goal, bombing the place where they currently are is a strange way to achieve that strategic objective. A fact that has not gone unnoticed in Israel, where people are protesting this latest military offensive primarily on those grounds. But that obviously isn't their goal, and it never was. It's why it has been so difficult for the ceasefire to be negotiated in the first place. It's why, whenever a set of terms has been agreed to, the Israeli government has simply demanded more. And it's why they are doing their best to make Gaza as inhospitable of a place for human habitation as possible. They want to entirely ethnically cleanse that territory, as they do with all Palestinian land. They want to annex it, and they want eventually to settle it. The Biden administration and the rest of the leaders of the so called free world did nothing at all to dissuade them from attempting to do that. And the current administration is literally foaming at the mouth as they struggle to conceal their obvious raging erections at the idea of the continued slaughter of Palestinian civilians. There are no good parts of this story. There are no good actors. Everything about this is terrible. If there are history books in 50 years, which tragically is not a given, we are going to look back at this period in history with abject horror and disgust. And if we don't, it will be because we are truly lost as a civilization. There is no justification for genocide, and this is genocide. There's no political reason why this is somehow okay, regardless of your opinions about the overall conflict. We crossed the pale 50,000 dead people ago. We've been fully beyond it for a while. I defy you to justify this to anyone with a conscience. I'm sorry to start off so depressing, but I wouldn't be being honest about the way that I covered this otherwise. We will continue to keep our eye on it and bring you more analysis about it as the situation continues to develop. This really deserved to be the whole episode, but so many other things are happening that I couldn't justify making it that. But I also couldn't not talk about it. And you should already be paying attention. If you are wondering what you would have been doing if you were alive during any one of the horrific genocides of the 20th century or earlier, the answer is whatever you're doing right now. If that's nothing, It was going to be nothing then. But I understand the impulse to say nothing, particularly if you live in the United States, because apparently the opinions I just expressed are literally illegal there, in the ancestral homeland of the free speech absolutist, where they make the obnoxious debate lord. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, or as he is known to his boss, Little Marco, the tiny Mexican one, old sweaty McWater bottle, took a break from being a regular piece of shit neocon to go full fascist and is now revoking the visas and green cards of legal residents of the United States for their political speech and having them effectively disappeared by the US government. This is also something we are going to cover in more detail, but for now I'll say this. If you're a leftist, if you're a person of conscience, if you are a civilized human being who actually believes in any of the values Western civilization, quote unquote, pretends to be about, and you're not already there, don't go to America. Don't visit. Don't spend your money there. If you can, try not to buy things that are made in America. That country has lost its right to be called a part of the free world, let alone its claim to lead it. It is not safe for you. It's not moral. It's not ethical. And you just shouldn't go. Moving on. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan arrested his main political rival, Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, reaching the end of his villain arc and smoothly transitioning from soft authoritarian to hard authoritarian. And in response, a massive wave of protests has erupted across every major city in the country. I'm going to do a whole episode about this as well with some context on how Erdogan was able to become this powerful in the first place. But for now, I'll say these two things. One is that this is an alarming escalation of Erdogan's exercise of power. Up until this point, he's mostly respected, at least theoretically, the idea that Turkey is a democracy. Even if he has used his soft power to undermine the democratic process in various ways in order to tip the democratic balance in his favor, this is the first time that he's explicitly used his power to directly prevent a democratic challenge to his rule during an election. This is Putin-level authoritarian stuff, and it will prove to be a watershed moment in Turkish history, however it plays out. The second thing I'll say is, Americans, this is how the fuck you're supposed to behave when the president starts doing authoritarian shit. There are hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Istanbul right now, a city which is population-wise roughly the size of New York. And I'm going to be honest, arresting your main political opponent sounds worse than what is happening in America right now, but it objectively is not. Your government is disappearing people with no due process for their political opinions. That is much farther down the fascist pipeline than arresting people who are actively involved in challenging the government in the halls of power. Maybe you guys should take some notes. And finally, we're having a federal election in Canada on April 28th. We'll be doing a full breakdown of the different parties and their platforms and proposed policies in the coming weeks, similar to what we did for the Ontario provincial elections. But for now, we'll just say that we here at the Bad Eye Podcast are pretty disappointed with all three major parties and what they've shown us so far. The Overton window seems to have shifted pretty far to the right in this country as well, although obviously not as far as it has in the United States, which, if you've been listening for a while, you'd know that that's kind of our whole thing. But this time, even the NDP are running to the center, which is part of why we wanted to bring you this talk with Abdullah now, to remind people what actual progressive politics look and sound like when put into practice in the real world. For those of you who might need a reminder, Abdullah is a writer and researcher based at the Brown University School of Public Health. He directs narrative projects and policy impact initiatives at the People, Place, and Health Collective at Brown. He's a friend of the show and a friend of the host. And this week, he and I are talking a bit about his work in the harm reduction space, working specifically on the opioid crisis, about safe injection sites, and about harm reduction-based drug policy more broadly. This will be a part of a pre-recorded conversation that we had before our break, but I promise the conversation remains as relevant and interesting today as it was when we had it. I hope you guys enjoy. All right, so we are here with Abdullah. I'll just introduce the topic a little bit, if that's all right with you, and we'll just get right into it. We did an Ontario election special that at the time this is going to be released will have been out for a couple of weeks, but we're recording this before the election. One of the issues that's being discussed is the opioid crisis and what should be done to address it. I know that's something you've done a fair amount of work in. Just for some background for the listeners who might not be aware, the Conservative provincial government here closed nearly all safe injection sites in Ontario. And their solution to this problem so far has been, a general policy of criminalization and enforcement. There's been no real other they don't have the kind of interdictive tools that the federal government has of like trying to prevent things from coming across the border. So the tools that they have to address it are basically, arresting people for having and using drugs. That's the main tool that people have been using, or that the government here, the Ontario government, has been using to attempt to address this opioid crisis. And you know, even they would admit that like it hasn't been working. I mean, there are more people on the streets, just generally. I mean, because of the economy, and for a variety of reasons. And more of those people visibly seem to be using drugs, which whether or not that is actually true is also something that I think is up for debate. But there's certainly a perception that it's true. So the progressive conservative government in this election has basically promised to just double down on that enforcement. That's their solution to this problem, is to and go after associated things to address kind of the visibility of it. Like they're basically making homelessness illegal. They're gonna, if you're in an encampment, they'll arrest you and fine you $10,000 to $15,000, which you obviously cannot pay because you live in an encampment. And if you can't pay it, you're going to go to jail. If you have any drugs, that's an additional charge. You're going to go to jail for even longer. That's really their solution to this problem. It doesn't seem to have worked the first time, and I don't think it's going to work this time. The Liberal government, or the Liberal Party, rather, who may or may not be the Liberal government when this podcast episode is released, their approach has focused less on enforcement, but also hasn't really, like, they haven't pledged to reopen the safe injection sites. Their main, way of addressing this issue seems to be they want to fund more mental health care, which in principle I don't think is a bad thing. But I'm curious to hear like your thoughts on like whether or not that will address the issue, because I know that like this is an area of expertise that you have. We've talked about safe injection sites before and their utility and their value. Do you think this is a problem that can be addressed without them? And to what extent do you think that like mental health care, I mean, barring questions about like what that even looks like, because mental health care could be a bunch of different things. But like, do you think that, is that even a component of addressing the solution, or is that just kind of, a distraction in the same way that the enforcement is a distraction?
I think the conversation. So for context, my main work in the United States is overdose prevention and harm reduction. Overdose prevention through harm reduction strategies. I did my master's of public health in overdose prevention. My boss is Canadian. So a trend in U.S. drug policy is a lot of Canadians being imported from Canada to come and help make U.S. drug policy a lot better. And so in the U.S. we have the U.S. now. A couple of years ago when I came to the United States to do my MPH, also like doing an MPH in 2018, like just as an aside, like I finished my MPH. I started my MPH in 2018, and obviously Trump was president then, and the U.S. seemed like a crazy place. But I could not have encountered what I was signing up for when I signed up for public health in 2018. And I like to say that like there's this meme that there's this saying that people have about like catching the last chopper out of Vietnam, like as if like, oh, like like you were like being in a relationship now, it seems, or getting married now, it seems like getting the last chopper out of Vietnam. And I have to say, like graduating with an MPH in 2020 into the pandemic is like taking the first chopper into Vietnam. Like it's just like it's like it hasn't gotten better. It's just like it's downhill from there. But anyways, that aside, the we do have one positive. I should say there is positives. It's not all Vietnam choppers. Is that the U.S. does have safe consumption sites now. We have one operating in New York City, in East Harlem, and two actually in East Harlem and in Washington Heights. There's one that's just opened here in Providence, which is why I do some work. I don't do work at the OPC, but I do research around it. Or rather, I work on a research team that does research around it. And then Vermont has just approved a site. And that is all because sites in Canada got approved. And I think it's important to remember that Canada, I think there's a perception that Canada has had these safe consumption sites for a long time. And that's just not the case. Canada has had one site in Vancouver that opened in 2003. And for about 14 years, it was the only site in Canada. It got an Health Canada exemption during the Harper government. And the Supreme Court of Canada actually ruled that closing these sites or denying this exemption would be a violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms for people who use drugs, which is why like any sort of future action against these sites would probably require the government to invoke the notwithstanding clause at some point, because they would be subject to a charter challenge. Which again, the fact that they're not, the fact that you can just say we're gonna like ignore the Constitution and that's legal, it's just like an insane concept. But like, I digress.
Especially the use of the word "notwithstanding" in that context. That
But like, I digress. And so the reason why Canada ended up having like, I think it was like, I forget the actual amount. I think it was more than 30 before this latest round of Ontario, and Alberta closed a few too, but at its peak, we had, I think, more than 30 of these sites across Canada. And that's because in
right.
2017, during the height of this crisis, a bunch of volunteers in Toronto decided not to wait anymore, and they opened their own site in Moss Park in Toronto. And, from there, the Liberal government then sort of granted the exemption. And that sort of caused these sites to then become more of a, rather than some people reversing overdoses in a tent in a park, they became more standalone official sites. You had governments, you had Toronto Public Health and other sort of official government public health entities operate these sites or fund these sites. And you also had them sort of, again, being more like official locations. And so that's just a little background on how these sites are and what they are. And if people don't know what they are, they're just sites where people bring their own drugs, and they can use them, and people can overdose. If someone overdoses, people can reverse those overdoses. It brings drug use out of the street, right? If people don't like seeing drug use, and OPC is a great place because it takes the drug use behind the scenes in closed doors in a supportive environment. It is also, if someone is not overdosing on the street and they're overdosing in a supportive environment, you don't need an EMS run, right? Like EMS, you have to call if someone is overdosing on the street. If they're overdosing in a safe injection site facility, you can kind of, the way people are trained is that they can identify an overdose while it's happening or at the beginning of when it's happening. And so that is not only has less strain on sort of like emergency services, it's actually way more pleasant for the person. Not pleasant is the wrong word, but like it's a lot less unpleasant for the person who is overdosing, because the primary way in which folks reverse overdoses in OPC is through the use of oxygen. They just give them a lot of oxygen, and that allows them to sort of come back. Whereas the way naloxone works and naloxone is sort of the emergency opioid antidote, is that it
Right.
just goes in your brain and kicks out the opioids from the opioid receptors, and that makes people feel very sick. It makes people feel like they're in withdrawal, and can agitate them and can make them feel, it's just not pleasant.
It's just generally unpleasant
Yeah, and
experience.
so that makes overdose response on the street a lot more chaotic and a lot more, just more stressful, not only for the person, but also just for EMS and all that stuff, than it does in an OPC. So that's like the benefit of an OPC in a nutshell. OPCs obviously are not going to solve the overdose crisis. I think it's just like a ridiculous thing that some people hold them to the standard that they need to solve the overdose crisis. It's like saying, for me, it's like saying, well, emergency rooms don't stop people from being in an emergency in the first place. So let's just get rid of hospitals. Let's just get rid of emergency rooms. They're not affected, right? Like the emergency room is the last, like it is a light intervention into someone, like preventing death, right? You go to the emergency room to receive a last attempt at care so that you don't die.
Yeah, like a final point of care.
That's how OPC should be viewed. They should be viewed as these sort of emergency rooms. It's not like you could say, it's not like people say, you could say like, yeah, we should prevent accidents before they happen. but no one would say,
Right.
okay, we'll design better cars so we can get rid of emergency rooms. Like, it's not really a same thing. So it's kind of silly to me when people are like, well, we need, more mental health beds, and then they don't reference OPCs, because we're still at a point with this overdose crisis that people are going to continue to overdose, and you're going to have to need, a response to that. And that emergency response can either be chaotic and tax the ambulance resources and take up space at the emergency room. And again, I don't mean to say take up space, because these are people's lives. Like, they obviously deserve to be in the emergency room if that's what they need. But like, people have to realize that it's completely unnecessary. If we can like reduce the cost on healthcare systems and free up emergency, like, people are like, oh, the emergency room wait time is so much higher. Like, do you
Yeah.
think like it'll get better if like all the OPCs are closed and you're diverting
Yeah.
all the overdoses to the emergency room? So
Like take up space in the way that like they have a legitimate medical need to be there, but there's an alternative that would not require them to be there at all. And so if we were able to do that, then that would free up the space in the emergency room for people who do not have that medical alternative. Like if you break your leg, you go to the emergency room because you need that kind of triage treatment. If you, well, actually, I don't know that that's the case for a broken leg. I'm not really sure what they do for a broken leg, but like, if you get shot, or you like or if you're having a heart attack, like there's no like there's no OPC for the heart attack. Like you need to go to the hospital and you need to be treated in an emergency room.
and
Uh,
the thing is, drug use in particular is a very difficult thing to address, because it is tied up with so many other societal things. In fact, like, part of it is that like is addressing poverty and addressing sort of all sorts of other things that cause people to experience, trauma and, uncertainty in their lives. Because once someone is, and again, not everyone is hooked on drugs, right? Like, there are people who, no matter how often they use, will not develop a substance use issue. There are other people.
yeah, that's actually a really important point that I want to hammer that home for people, because I think that like particularly because of the way that like education about drugs happens in schools, in at least in this country, like, you know, I was told specifically that like if you try opiates once, you will get addicted. Like you will get addicted, which is patently untrue.
Yeah,
And at the same time, like it also like made me resistant when I was prescribed an opiate by a doctor for a legitimate medical reason. It made me resistant to take the medication that I was prescribed. And like it shouldn't like I think that part of the, I mean, this isn't really going to address the issue or the crisis, but a component of it needs to be just like better, more fact-based education about opiates and about drugs in general and drug use in general that is not tied up in so much morality. Because I think that a lot of the reasons that this happens, a lot of the reasons that there's resistance to these injection sites in the first place is a moral idea that people have about drug use, that it is inherently wrong. And you're free to believe that if you want. Like I can't stop you from feeling that way, but I would encourage you to interrogate. And I don't know, maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't. I would encourage you to interrogate whether or not that belief is helpful. Like,
and the funny thing is, like, I mean, I can't deny it, and because I have a religious abstention from these substances, like that means I do believe they're like, at least I have this sort of, moral personal belief that they are harmful. That said, right, like, um, I always find it funny when people are like, "Well, I'm against drugs, but alcohol is fine." But alcohol is
yeah.
also like, pretty darn, like, it can have similar effects. It's just it's again, some people are able to drink alcohol and have no problems, and there are other people who have a lot of problems with alcohol. But society is more set up to deal with people's functioning alcoholism than it is
Yeah.
to, deal with people's drug problems. Although, like, a lot of what people might see on the street also isn't necessarily just drug use. I think people are assuming it's just drug use, but that a good portion of that is alcohol. But
Yeah, and that's another thing that I just real quick. I want to address that too, because I feel like in particular with alcohol, like alcohol is a very serious narcotic, and we talk about it as if it is not, or maybe narcotic is not the right medical term for it, but it's a very serious like drug in terms of like its addictive potential, in terms of its negative potential for it to have negative health outcomes on your body. Like consuming alcohol on a regular basis is, you know, as bad for you as many of the things that we consider to be much more serious drugs. Like it is actually just very bad for you, but because, to your point, it's so normalized in society, we don't talk about it that way.
Yeah.
Like it's much more harmful to your body to consume alcohol on a regular basis than, you know, like marijuana. I mean, which in Canada, like now we've, you know, kind of come around to the idea that like you know, and not to write off the potential negative health outcomes of marijuana either. Like there are neurological impacts. You know, just smoking is bad for your lungs, although there are other ways to ingest marijuana. But like the idea that, you know, alcohol is, you know, benign, and sometimes people even talk about it as if it's healthy, like, you know, like, oh, like a glass of wine, it's, you know, the antioxidants, like eat blueberries, man, like there are way better ways to get antioxidants than like a glass of poison. Like, and I say that as somebody who occasionally does drink, like I enjoy alcohol, but like to talk about it as if it is, you know, nothing, in the same way that we talk about other drugs that are, you know, equally or sometimes even, you know, more benign in terms of their impacts on your body, we talk about those in a much more serious way than we talk about alcohol. And it is, like, to your point, just like a cultural thing. Like,
For sure, and I think, you know, going back to the point about, like, you know, drug use. Some people drug use not being problematic. Some people it will be problematic. That is, you know, people will are going to use drugs. That is just a, you know, fact. We can there are policies and stuff that we can take to reduce the amount of drug use effectively and to reduce the harmful impacts of drug use. I mean, I think, you know, people don't think of it as a drug, but a key success story is with tobacco and cigarettes. Like, we have genuinely decreased the amount of people who smoke cigarettes. That doesn't mean smoking has, you know, been eliminated, but like there are sort of, you know, productive ways to address a drug problem. But you also have to kind of, you know, acknowledge the fact that there will be people who use drugs, and there will be people who, you know, have substance use issues that are problematic. And once someone has a problematic substance use issue, it's not, some people will, you know, we hope to get people into treatment, and we do the best we can to get people into treatment and recovery. But there will also be people who, you know, treatment doesn't work for them. And
yeah,
they, for instance, uh, with opioid use disorder, we actually have medications. Same thing with alcohol. We have Suboxone with alcohol. There's also some promising research around GLP-1s, specifically how it targets certain, you know, reward pathways in the brain. So that is promising. But for instance, with stimulants, there is no treatment. It is just pure abstinence. It is pure, like, 12-step
right.
um sort of programs. And so part of the challenge is to develop, you know, both a framework to deal with drug use as it happens, both getting people into treatment, but also just dealing with people who, you know, will use drugs and will, like, may not be receptive to treatment. And you can either choose to, you know, house them in some way, and
Yeah,
that house can either be prison, or it can be something that's, you know, just housing.
cheaper and more
Yeah.
humane.
And then another thing is, like, you know, if you want less, some people just decide to recreationally try drugs and end up with a problem, right? That's some people.
Yeah,
Some people, you know, and I don't think we have this issue anymore necessarily, but we have obviously the prescription opioids and stuff like that. But we also have a lot of people who take drugs because they, again, there's financial circumstances or mental health issues, or even just like stress, right? Like teenagers, a big reason why we have teenagers who have died of fentanyl overdoses is not because they are smoking or injecting fentanyl. It's because they're seeking out prescription pills, they're seeking out oxys, they're seeking out you know, even Xanax and stuff like that, just to, like, because there's such, you know, there's such a bundle of nerves, and they're so
Yeah,
anxious.
it's difficult to be a young
Yeah,
person.
and so they're just looking for something to, like, chill out, and they take a pill and it has fentanyl in it. And so a lot of this is also just tied up to broader societal issues of how do we build a better
Yeah,
society. These problems won't be, the reason why it's so acute is because we have this drug supply problem, right? Before, we would just have been like, a lot of people are using drugs, it's not an issue. Now, because the drug supply is toxic, a lot of people are dying. And so
are
we
dying.
have
Yeah,
like two different issues, right? One is you want to address the dying issue, right? And that's where
yeah,
OPCs are helpful. They obviously cannot stop all the overdoses, right? And then you need a more long-term approach that actually deals with not only just like addressing drug use as a whole and addressing addiction. For instance, again, to me, it's asinine to separate these things from alcohol. In the United States, for instance, people are like, fentanyl is some unique evil, but then we are, if anything, more permissive on alcohol than Canada is. And we have decided that it's okay to push a to we've decided to that it would be a good idea to make sports gambling a widespread thing and have it
yeah.
accessible on phones and everything, like pushing
Ugh.
it more another sort of potent addiction. So I think, like, that's another thing is, like, to address the sort of widespread issues, you need to address like other sort of addiction issues that people are experiencing.
Yeah, that can contribute
Yeah.
even also,
Ab-
like, because if you lose a huge sports bet, you're gonna want to drink. Like that's
yes, and most likely, unfortunately, like, beat your significant other. That is,
yeah, like
there's unfortunate research that shows that, just like with the research of that shows when sports teams lose, domestic violence
yeah,
cases goes up. I think there's now research that
yeah.
shows
I can't imagine adding money to that
exactly,
equation is making
exactly.
that any
And
better.
then it's
Like,
just like, just the same societal problems that we deal with, right? Housing, healthcare. Um,
yeah, I actually to your point, like Patricia in the episode that now a few weeks ago, and I were talking about this exact issue. Well, not about opioids specifically, but you know, a lot of the mental health crisis that we keep talking about and hearing about, which is I think connected to the opioid crisis. I think you're right. Like, can just be addressed by making people's lives less shitty. Like if you're poor and your day-to-day existence is unpleasant because you just don't have the ability to do fun things that you enjoy, you're going to seek out experiences that are at least temporarily either numb you enough to not think about that, or like I to bring this back to the morality thing for a bit, like drugs are fun. Like that's a reality is like if you're a person who's done drugs before in your life, not all of them are equally fun, but some of them are fun. And so if you don't have other sources of enjoyment and other sources of like other avenues in which you could be living a life that's fulfilling and enjoyable, you're going to do drugs because you're a human being and you want to experience pleasure. And I think that coming at this, I don't want to harp on the morality aspect of it too much, but I do think that it's a particularly damaging element of this. Even though, like, I know that like you have a moral objection to drugs, but I think that the difference is that your moral objection to it, or at least your moral aversion to it, leads you to the conclusion that it would be better if people don't do it, and so you want to take steps to prevent that from happening by addressing it at the root
yeah, and I
cause.
think my moral aversion is less, like, I would just be fundamentally clear for people. I do not drink drugs. I see why people take drugs and alcohol, right? Like,
Yeah,
it does have positive. It does make people feel good, and that you could argue is a positive impact. The reason why I don't take drugs and alcohol is because I believe God has told me not to take drugs and alcohol, and so,
yeah,
and I believe then, as a my you know sort of human uh like reasoning is that, like, oh, it must be because of these sort of harms, right? One thing I actually found really interesting is and I think you and I have talked about this, is that Iran is, as you know, it is a theocracy based on religion. And you know, Islam, as you know, as I have said, is one that does not permit the use of substances that alter the mind to a significant degree.
Yeah.
And so like generally this is interpreted to be like things that, significantly change your mental state to a degree that impairs you. So which is why like coffee, for instance, is um not considered something that is prohibited. Whereas if you're
Yeah.
more
Although there historically has been a lot of
yeah,
debate
yeah,
in
yeah,
the
for
Islamic
sure.
world about that.
Although
Uh,
Mormons aren't allowed because
yeah,
of
Mormons
the hot
came out on the
drinks.
other side of that
There's the
debate.
hot drinks prohibition. But anyways,
Yeah.
I digress. So Iran in the 90s, of course, had a very draconian drug policy, and I'm not trying to suggest that it's not still draconian to a certain extent, but it's a lot better. But they found that like, okay, we were just executing drug dealers, we're just killing people who use drugs, which is still the enlightened position of a country called Singapore, which has a very, very strict drug policy.
Yep.
But Iran saw,
Much of Southeast Asia,
yes,
actually.
Iran saw that HIV rates, caused by injection drug use, and of course, Iran, it's natural for them to have. So well, it's not natural, but they produce opium, right? So and are
Yeah.
close to a country that also produces opium, so it makes sense that there would be a drug problem. They don't have an overdose problem in Iran. They have a drug use problem in Iran.
Yeah.
So because like heroin, for instance, is very cheap to access, there's no need for a fentanyl, like they don't, it's
Yeah.
already just so cheap and there. And so they found that HIV rates associated with injection drug use were incredibly high in Iran, especially in the 90s. It wasn't going down. And so in the 2000s, when I think, and this is, I think, when the early, I think the Reformist Party was in power in Iran before Ahmadinejad. I think it was Khatami.
Yeah.
Um, Iran then, employed basically employed syringe service programs. And essentially what would happen is that the government workers represented by the government of Iran, funded by the government of Iran, would go and to people who use drugs and take their old syringes away and give them new syringes. And this was, of course, very successful. They reduced the amount of HIV infections. Iran also, expanded, from what I know, expand, probably not dramatically, but did expand methadone and other sort of treatment programs.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm not trying to suggest that Iran is some sort of progressive drug policy thing, but to me, it is a very interesting um, thing for
Well, that is extraordinarily progressive for the
yeah, for
region,
sure.
for sure.
And
Like,
I would say, like, they were doing this before some parts in America legalized some of this. Not all of this, right?
yeah.
But, like, to me, it's fascinating because it is this sort of people might see these things as contradictions. They're like, well, how can a society that views, or rather a government that views drug use as like a moral wrong, then somehow, like,
Yeah.
condone it through this sort of strategy, Um, and to me, it's just like because sometimes I was like, well, am I doing sort of inherently contradictory? And I think like I still like think that from time to time. Right? I still wonder like, am I
Yeah.
sort of betraying my values, whatever? But harm reduction essentially just is literally that, right? It's just like
Yeah. It's got
it's here,
reduction in the
just
name.
these are people who are going to be using drugs anyways. You're not. It's not like you're introducing drug use to people. It's not you're like, oh, like here, come get addicted or whatever, right? Like it's not like
Yeah.
you're pushing prescription pills on people. You are literally just um giving them new supplies and new things to keep them alive one day longer. And
Yeah.
maybe at some point, then that leads them to treatment and recovery. And sometimes it won't.
Yeah.
But it's like, I think the alternative then is then to argue, and some people do argue this, and I think it's, misguided, that the alternative then is to argue that, people, if they make this mistake, they should die. If they make this mistake and they die in the process, then that is, the sort of consequence.
Yeah. It's social Darwinism,
Yeah, that's the
basically.
sort of
Like,
consequence, and you shouldn't interrupt it. By doing it, you're enabling drug use, right?
yeah.
And it
So
yeah, go ahead.
that's the kind of moralizing that I'm
Yeah.
talking about. And the reason that I think that that is such a fundamental issue here is, and it's like, the issue isn't really fundamentally like finding drug use moral or
Yes.
immoral. It's the issue is really, you know, finding a person who uses drugs to be a fundamentally moral or
Yes.
immoral human being. It's not about the act, it's about the human
Absolutely.
being. And I'm going to come at this from a slightly different but also equally personal perspective, because I think that this is a thing that we do with a lot of the other things that we don't associate with, that we don't think about in the same way that we think about drug use. So like, I used to be morbidly obese. That was I think, I mean, you know that about me. The listeners who have never seen me may not know that about me. I used to be morbidly obese. In over the course of the pandemic, I lost about 180 pounds. It was a significant amount of weight. And like, a thing that I can tell you from living as an obese person for a long time is that people attach morality to the physical state of obesity. And they use, in the same way that people use with drug use, they use health outcomes, and they'll say like, oh, it's bad for you to be fat, it's bad for you, and so that makes it wrong. And they never say that last part out loud, but it is very clear in the way that they talk about and that they think about fat people, that there is a morality that they are attaching to the existence of living in a large body, in the same way that there is a morality that people attach to a person who uses drugs. And the reason that that's so unproductive is that in both cases that morality is not helpful. Like, it's not helpful for you to judge a person who uses drugs. It doesn't help them stop using drugs in any way, in the same way that attaching morality to fatness, I mean, one, and also, it's not a thing that we moralize similar things that produce similar health outcomes in the same way. So, like, a good example is alcohol. Like, alcohol has a very similar effect on your body to other narcotics, that we do attach this like moral judgment of people who use that. In the same way, like not sleeping enough is actually associated with a lot of the same health outcomes as being very fat. Like actually just like getting like less than 6 hours of sleep a night leads to almost all of this, like increased rates of cardiac problems going forward, high cholesterol, like high cortisol, just all sorts of things that are normally associated with obesity. You can get all those same things just by not sleeping
Mhm.
enough. But we never ever talk to people who don't sleep enough and say like, oh, you're morally indolent, or there's something that you're doing that wrong in your life. And I think that, like, from the existence of a person who lived that way for a very long time, like, that morality actually keeps you, or like that moralizing actually keeps you from improving your circumstance, because it makes you feel like shit, and if you feel like shit, you're going to want to stay fat. Like, and in the same way that, like, there are people who use drugs who are going to continue to use drugs, who are, may or may not ever have any negative outcomes in their life, health wise or otherwise. Like, there there are people who are fat, who are, they live till they're 80, and they they have none of the associated health outcomes with that come from obesity. I think that, like, the parallel is good and useful and instructive, and I think that, like, it's important to divorce the solutions to those issues, because they are issues, from that kind of moralizing. I think that is if if you take anything from this conversation, uh like, harm reduction, as an approach, requires you to divorce a little bit, to an extent, your personal feelings about, other people's choices from, like, what is actually going to help these people, what's actually going to get, what's actually going to produce a positive outcome in their lives, because that's fundamentally what it's about.
For sure. And I think like with what you said with drug use, with obesity and stuff, to a certain extent, again, I don't necessarily agree with it, right? But to a certain extent, I can understand, because I semi share this, even though I don't project it to people. But I can understand if you view people who use drugs a certain way as being sort of morally bad. I don't agree with it, but I can understand it if that is based in some sort of belief system.
Right.
What you often see, though, and you've made this case with people who are obese, people who use drugs, is anything that is like just unappealing to people in terms of visually unappealing, right? So we're talking about public drug
Yes.
use. We're talking about just like the image of a large person. That is considered just, anything that upsets people is then considered quote unquote morally wrong. And so, because then the same people will not have a problem with, alcohol because it doesn't, to them doesn't manifest the same way. And
Yeah.
even if they see it on the street, it's easy to blame it on drugs, even though it may be alcohol.
Yeah.
And the same thing like with casual drug use, right? Cocaine does not have nearly as much stigma as, like, for instance, you don't call someone a cokehead as much as you call them a crackhead, and that's because like that's
Yeah.
even though they're basically the same drug. Um,
And honestly, cokeheads are much more obnoxious than crackheads. Having encountered a couple of both in my life, like cokeheads are by far more annoying and sometimes more dangerous. Like,
and it's just like, I think there's some differences in terms of how the drugs are, but they're otherwise, more or less very similar.
yeah,
It's just, there are different connotations. Like we associate coke with people who are wealthy and people who, do it
yeah,
at parties, and as a result, it has a very different connotation than crack, which we associate with, predominantly racialized, and also just people on the street who
yeah,
use crack. And so, in the same way, you might view someone who has a prescription pill problem very differently than someone who has like a heroin or fentanyl issue. Um,
yeah,
and that has everything to do with how we perceive these people and how we perceive them as being not even a threat necessarily, but just an annoyance, right? Like it is just annoying to be for people
yeah,
to view drug use. It is just annoying for people, and I wouldn't even say drug use, just because no one has problems viewing, like, let's say someone doing lines of cocaine at a party. No one really, people don't really have it.
yeah.
I mean, I've never been in that situation. I've never actually seen someone do lines of cocaine at a party. It's funny. I was,
I will say like it does depend on the
yes,
party. Like there's certain like if you're like doing lines at like a kid's birthday party, then
yes,
I'm like, all right, man.
yeah.
Like,
I will say it's pretty funny that like I was on there was a film festival here about harm reduction and recovery here in Providence, and I was on a panel, and I was telling them that like I feel like it's very bizarre to be if you told me like 8 years ago that I would know so much about drug use without like having used once, it would just be a bizarre phenomenon. But now I feel like I'm everyone's mom because I know more about like doing like hard drugs safer than the people who actually do the hard drugs. It's like
yeah.
it's just like it's a bizarre situation. But of course, like the public drug use, specifically like injection, right? Injecting drug use,
Yeah.
and this is the thing, like injecting drug use, produces things that are much more distressing to see. Now, it's also why, for instance, in you New like places like Portland and San Francisco are perceived as having a much worse drug problem than, say, New York City or even Providence here, and that's because in these areas, right, it's a lot colder. The climates are a lot less hospitable, and we don't. As a result, it doesn't necessarily lead to a culture of public outdoor drug use. It does. It
Right.
does in some cases. Of course, I'm not saying it's not like it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, we do see
For
it
sure.
here, but
But I think, in San Francisco, in Portland and stuff, where the weather is a little bit warmer, where the culture is just, no, I don't want to say culture in the sense of like thing, but there's just more of a active open drug use has just historically been more of a thing over there, and it has a lot to do
yeah.
with the weather. Um, because people are unhoused, of course, right? And
Yeah.
so do you see a lot more drug use, right? Do I think necessarily that San Francisco has more drug use than New York has more drug use than Providence? The, Providence, yes, because we're not a big city, but New York, no. But it's just more visible because the
Yeah.
conditions there, and those conditions have nothing to do with the people using the drug or the drugs that are being used. It's just the conditions that surround them make it more visible, and so as a result, people perceive San Francisco and Portland as having a much more serious drug
Yeah.
problems than, say, New York City, even though likely New York City has the same sort of drug use. And it's like it's just tied to seeing it, right? And of course, like, you know, I don't deny it's not pleasant to see, right?
Yeah.
It isn't, but then of course, then why wouldn't you just support? Why wouldn't you just want people to do it inside in a room that is like kind of,
Yeah, in a
even if you
safe
don't
environment
care
that
about their like personal health? Why wouldn't you?
yeah, just to get it out of your
Exactly,
way.
exactly. It's just, it's these things are just so like it really is so cynical because like it's just people don't want, they just want people to be essentially be disappeared, right? I don't want to see it.
Yeah, they don't want to look at it, which is like to bring it back to the conservative policy. That is their
Mm.
plan. It's to criminalize homelessness and then just put them in jail because you don't have to think about them if they're in jail. Um,
Yeah, and again,
I mean, just to like maybe this will be the final element of this that I introduce because I mean we're
long,
we've been talking for a while now, but well, I don't want to keep
no,
you
for
too
sure.
long, but just like a final element of this that I'll introduce is like I'll say that one of the ways that I think that like the obesity parallel doesn't work is in terms of the potential for harm, either real or imagined, to
Yes,
others. Like people find obese people visually unappealing to look at, but like there's no actual danger there. Whereas, you know, drug use can cause erratic behavior, and that erratic behavior sometimes can be violent, and it is difficult to tell from, particularly if you're not a person who uses drugs and you're not a person who's familiar with people who use drugs, it is difficult to tell when someone is behaving erratically around you whether or not they are going to be a threat to you.
absolutely,
So I think that like an element of this that needs to be considered again, like and harm reduction plays a huge role in this, and like these safe injection sites would be an actual solution to this problem for the reason that you just described. That like mitigating the harm done to others, both the real harm and even just like having syringes lying around is not super safe. Like you can, like used needles are like a biohazard, and like if you step on one and you're wearing sandals, like there are actual negative outcomes that can happen that are associated with like public injection drug use. Um, so like an element of this that we can think of and consider harm reduction not just as like a tool for helping the people who use the drugs, but also that like getting those people into a safe environment where like they are not leaving used needles all over the place and they're not, like muttering to themselves on the subway and creeping everyone out, is that like you're also mitigating the even the imagined harm that's done to others by like getting them into a place where like the people around them are going to one understand that behavior for what it is, which is usually benign, and two, you know even when there is a person who gets violent or gets a little bit more erratic than people would like people to be in public, like that, there's trained people around them who are equipped to deal with that and to be able to actually assist and intervene both for the people and for the general public,
for
like
sure. And I think one thing that I think it's hard for people to talk about because they don't want necessarily to play into a reactionary politic. Is that, yeah, like violence is a very real thing that can occur when it comes to people who are unhoused and people who use drugs. That doesn't mean it is disproportionately a thing. I think, like, so for instance, I in the last, I would say, year um I have been like either subject to or witnessed just behavior that was either off-putting or violent. So in I've been sort of shoved on a subway platform, not like into a train or something, but just just I was in the there was someone who was experiencing psychosis, and I just was in the way, and they like pushed me out of the way. um there's that, but then also, and there's more unsightly things where you see someone like spit on someone on a subway car. I've been like when you're leaving a subway exit, and then some white person who again is clearly not well tells you like wants to come in the same way, so they shout um at the top of their lungs, they like watch your place N word. Yeah, that happened, and then most recent in Providence, I've also been like lightly assaulted. I wouldn't say assaulted. That's a hard word. Like, but I've been like lightly slapped by someone who was like
That's
unhoused, right?
assaulted. I feel like you don't need
Um,
to minimize that for
I
yourself.
yeah, my mom. I haven't. Hopefully, my mom doesn't listen. But like, but yeah, of course, I'm thankfully,
if you are listening, Abdullah, I can see him. He's
yeah.
fine.
But
Uh,
yeah, these things are like, obviously they're traumatizing to view and stuff, but they are, you
yeah,
know, thankfully I was okay in all aspects. But I also think, I remember that uh I interact with a lot of homeless people in Providence. Some homeless people actually can recognize me in Providence at this point, because I interact with them, a lot of them. Brief interactions, I should say. Um, and by and large, most of my interactions are positive. I would say like 95% of my interactions are positive. Just these small interactions here and there cause certain issues, right? And so
yeah,
violence and issues with is will always be a consideration for people with mental health issues. I know people at OPCs, they have particular protocols for keeping people safe, not only for keeping, the staff safe, but also keeping people who use safe from, other people that may be an issue. And of course, there are also like, rules, right? It's not like you can just come into a space and do what you want, no matter what drug use you have, or well, no matter what
yeah,
sort of mental health issue you have. Like if you violate certain rules after a while, like, then yeah, if you're a threat to other people's safety, they won't call the police on you, but like you may not be able to use that space anymore, or there may be like, certain precautions and considerations that need to be taken. But of course, like, that is all of this violence here is not recognized as a thing that is like unique to this population and somehow disproportionate to this population. That's one thing. And the second thing is that there's special care and consideration taken to how do we deal with this act of violence, rather than just
yeah,
being like, this person is a threat and we need to just get rid of them. Because like in the United States, a lot of violent crime happens because people lose not everyone who commits a violent crime in the U.S. And I'm just ignoring like people with mental health issues, but a lot of people who commit a violent crime in the United States don't necessarily have a pathological reason for committing a violent crime. They just have the means to do so and lose the ability to control themselves. And
yeah,
that is why we have so much gun violence. Is because people have access to guns, and if they didn't have access to guns, they wouldn't. They just wouldn't be effective at killing people. um,
yeah. They might punch somebody.
exactly.
Like,
Like a road rage incident wouldn't escalate to a first degree murder charge, right? So,
yeah,
that's to say, it's like, I think, people perceive the United States as a extremely violent society, as much, and I'm just like, well, if you gave everyone in France guns, or if you had as many guns in any other society, I think you would see
yeah.
similar issues. Um,
I mean, I will say, as a smug Canadian, and like I don't normally. I mean, we were just talking about this, but like it is crazy to me that they still have road rage, because I feel like if I were like in Canada, sometimes I'll be driving and I'll get mad, and then I will be like, I want to get out of my car and yell at this person, and then I think to myself, in Canada, I'm like, what if he just beats the shit out of me? Like, I don't know who's in this car. Like, what if? And if I feel like if I would be so polite to everybody if everyone around me had a gun. Like, I would be like the extra. I would be on my extra best behavior. So it's kind of crazy to me that Americans are, even though they know that everyone has a gun, they're still engaging in this road rage. But I guess it's human nature. Like, you lose your temper, you just get mad, and often
and it's
if in a society where everyone is armed, that does
and it's
escalate to
it's
violence.
it's like oftentimes why people who commit violence often commit violence against people they know, right? Like it's
Yeah,
especially with, and it's not, I don't even just mean domestic cases. I mean it's like, um that's just how arguments and stuff that can escalate.
Yeah, friends get in
Exactly.
fights at bars that,
Yeah, and so that's the sort of analogy that I sort of use to sort of keep it into context is that like um it's not necessarily that these people are specifically like an overly violent group of people. Um, in fact, I think when it comes, with the exception of like school shooters and everything, and this is purely anecdote. I have nothing to back this up, but I don't think you see a lot of homeless people committing gun crimes. I think they're actually more likely to be shot,
well,
than than to shoot someone. Um,
that actually makes sense for a variety of like guns are
mhm.
expensive. It's just, like they don't have access to guns because they cost money
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and
And so this is
so there's
this is
that.
not to say again that people don't that we minimize people's fears when it comes to seeing violence on the street or like being fearful of violence on the street, right? Um, but you know we have to contextualize that violence. A, we have to contextualize it, and then B, we have to be like there are better ways to respond. Just like
Yeah,
with guns, and we could make people's lives so much easier, rather than just throwing more people into prison if we just like reduce the amount of guns.
I think that ties in a little bit to the kind of moralizing point that I was talking about earlier, which is that like we attach a particular kind of morality and intention to people who are behaving
Mm,
erratically and assume that they are a threat in a way that another person who presents as more, even if they're just wearing nicer clothes, often like I find that like if someone looks homeless, quote unquote, like people are more inclined to be afraid of them than if they're wearing a suit. And so I think that you're right, it's important to contextualize that violence in the and actually think critically about like, are am I in danger right now, or do I just feel like I'm in danger right now because someone is behaving in a way that is making me uncomfortable? And not to say that that's not an issue, because it's still an issue, and like people have a right to feel comfortable in public spaces. Like I think that is a general thing that I believe is true, but our response to that shouldn't just be to immediately demonize and criminalize those people. There needs to be a more holistic solution than that, because it like those people are still people. Um, all right, let me wrap it up. All right, so first of all, like, thanks for your time. Thank you for being here. Thanks for being so generous with like your thoughts and your expertise. This is a really insightful discussion. It was really, personally, I learned a bunch about harm reduction that I didn't really know. I feel like people talk about public health a lot and they don't really have like a full under like it seems self-explanatory, but it also like objectively is not. And so I feel like this was probably a pretty clarifying discussion for a lot of people. I hope that the listeners get a lot out of it. But yeah, I just want to thank you for your time and for your thoughts. And then here at the Bad Eye Podcast, you know, such as it is, the tradition so far has been that at the end of the episode, in the case of last week, I and the guest recommend a piece of media that we've really been enjoying. It can be whatever you want. It can be a book, a movie, a song, podcast, whatever it is. So if you've got one, now would be the time.
Yeah. I'll recommend a book that I just finished. It's called Passage North. And it's by Anuk Arudpragasam. The book is called The Passage North, and basically it is a book that deals with this Sri Lankan Tamil dude, formerly graduate student from India, who is from a fairly upper middle class family in Colombo, who doesn't doesn't experience the Sri Lankan Civil War in the same way that people in the North did. And so the story basically deals with him traveling to the North, and in doing so, going through all these flashbacks of the last few years of his life, um, to attend the funeral of the caretaker of his grandmother. And this caretaker, she is from the North. She's someone who was affected by the end of the Civil War, And so a meditation not only on the Civil War itself, but also uh, uh, has an interesting perspective. It is a fiction book, of someone who shares that identity, but also like not really, because the different class, different geographic location, different the circumstance. And so it is a very good book, particularly I think if people want to understand the Sri Lankan Civil War more, or like just get a glimpse into the human aspect, and also get a glimpse into like how one can be of one ethnicity and be of one group and feel a kinship to people, but at the same time feels very distant, very far away, because your experiences, even in the same country, your experiences are just so different. So book was a finalist for the Booker Prize. It won it got a lot of accolades, and so that is a passage north.
Awesome. That sounds like an awesome book. I'm going to have to check it out. My recommendation this week is going to be the novel The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. It's a really powerfully upsetting novel about a woman who's a novelist who lives on an island run by the memory police, who are a kind of a shadowy cabal of people with the ability to make people forget literally anything, from their own names to the concept of what a hat is to how to speak entirely. It's a Japanese novel that I read in translation, and it's not a book that I read recently, but it is one that I've been thinking about a lot in the context of the kind of era of thought crime and the policing of speech and opinions that we seem to be entering. It's not a cheery read, I should warn you, but it'll make you think if that's something you find yourself feeling like doing right now. With that, that's it for this week's episode. As always, we're going to end with our thank yous. So, thank you to Abdullah, first of all, for being so generous with his thoughts and his expertise. Thank you to Saz Jazz Paris for allowing us to use his music. And thank you for listening and for bearing with our inconsistent release schedules as we come back from our break. Be easy, y'all.